The Sea Peoples. Around 1177 BCE, every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed within a single generation. The Hittite Empire, which had rivaled Egypt for centuries, vanished almost overnight. The city of Ugarit burned so suddenly that a clay tablet was left half-baked in the kiln. A letter from the king of Alashiya warning of enemy ships already spotted offshore. No reply was ever sent. And at the center of this civilizational implosion was a coalition of armies so devastating, so coordinated, and so completely unidentifiable that we still cannot say with certainty who they were or where they came from. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu, commissioned by Ramesses III around 1175 BCE, name at least 9 distinct groups: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denayan, and others, each carved with distinct helmets, ships, and weapons. French Egyptologist Emmanuel de Rouget coined the term Sea Peoples in 1855 after analyzing these carvings. Eric Klein's 2014 work documents how every major palace civilization of the late Bronze Age collapsed within roughly 50 years. DNA analysis of Philistine burial sites at Ashkelon, published in Science Advances in 2019 by Harney and colleagues, found Southern European genetic signatures, the only confirmed biological data point for any group. The mainstream view, championed by Klein and others, frames them as climate refugees riding a system's collapse. But the Medinet Habu reliefs don't show refugees. They show coordinated pincer movements across land and sea simultaneously. Refugees don't synchronize flanking maneuvers. Some researchers ask whether these were the Bronze Age's own disbanded armies turned conqueror, and whether someone, on both sides of the Mediterranean, carefully buried that connection. From armies that erased everyone else's history, we descend into silence. 50,000 soldiers, a desert, and not a single bone where there should be hundreds of thousands. The lost army of Cambyses. The Persian king Cambyses II had already conquered Egypt. He had desecrated the temples and mocked the gods of the Nile. So when the oracle of Amun at Siwa dared to declare his rule illegitimate, he sent an army to silence it. 50,000 soldiers marched west into the Sahara in 524 BCE. Not one returned, not one body, not one sword, not one sandal strap was found for 25 centuries. In a desert environment where organic material survives for millennia, the greatest mass military disappearance in history left the archaeological record completely blank. Herodotus recorded the event in History's Book 3 around 440 BCE, citing Egyptian informants who told him a catastrophic sandstorm buried the army alive. In 2009, twin brothers Angelo and Alfredo Castiglione announced a partial discovery near the Dakhla oasis: human bones, bronze weapon fragments, and horse skulls. But the find covered an area far too concentrated for 50,000 men, and Zahi Hawass of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities disputed the claim immediately, demanding peer-reviewed publication that, as of today, has still not appeared. Ancient Persian military logistics records indicate that a force of that size would have required approximately 600 tons of grain and 200,000 liters of water for the crossing, quantities no known supply depot along the route could have provided. Cambyses was meticulous about logistics. His Egyptian campaign was supplied by Phoenician naval support. Sending 50,000 men into the western desert without a supply chain isn't strategy. Some historians quietly ask whether Cambyses wanted them to disappear, and why the Persian Imperial Archive at Persepolis, which recorded even minor provincial expenditures, contains no record of any inquiry into their fate. From the Sahara silence, we cross the entire ancient world to find what may be Rome's most impossible ghost, a legion that supposedly died in the East and somehow ended up farming in China. the Roman legion that became Chinese. In 53 BCE, the Roman general Crassus marched 44,000 soldiers into Parthian territory and suffered the worst defeat in Roman history at Carrhae. 20,000 dead, 10,000 captured. And then those 10,000 prisoners vanished east into the Silk Road, and the Roman Empire never asked about them again. 17 years later, a Chinese military chronicle recorded something extraordinary during the Battle of Jiji in 36 BCE. The capture of foreign soldiers fighting in a Yulin Gen, a fish-scale formation of interlocked shields. No military force anywhere in Central Asia used that technique. It was Roman, exclusively Roman. Oxford historian Homer Dubbs first connected these accounts in a 1957 paper, pointing to the Han Dynasty settlement of captured foreign soldiers at a colony called Jielu, meaning captives who came a long way, in what is now Gansu province, historically called Lixian, a phonetic transliteration of the Latin word legio. Lanzhou University geneticist Zi Xiaodong's 2007 DNA study of 93 Zhalizhai village residents found over 56% carried West Eurasian genetic markers, statistically anomalous for a remote inland Chinese village. Physical anthropological surveys of the same population documented unusual rates of non-East Asian facial structure and above-average height. Pliny the Elder's Natural History confirms that Parthian kings used Roman prisoners as frontier garrison troops, establishing the pathway east. Most classical historians, including Adrian Goldsworthy, reject the hypothesis as romantic coincidence, arguing the genetic data reflects normal Silk Road mixing. But three independent anomalies, genetic, linguistic, and tactical, converging on one small village at one specific historical moment is a pattern, not a coincidence. Someone apparently decided this story didn't belong in the official record of either empire. We may never know why. From soldiers erased by distance and silence, we move to an army erased by something far more deliberate: chisels, fire, and the systematic removal of faces from stone. Akhenaten's erased army. When the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten died around 1336 BCE, the priests of Amun didn't just want his religion gone. They went into the tombs of his military commanders at Saqqara and erased them. Not just their titles, but their faces, carved out of eternity, one strike at a time. Akhenaten ruled for 17 years. He commanded an army large enough to maintain Egypt's entire imperial network from Nubia to Syria. That army had generals, chariot corps, logistics officers, and garrison troops numbering in the tens of thousands. After the systematic erasure ordered by his successor Horemheb, we cannot name a single officer who served that army with certainty. The military of one of Egypt's longest-reigning pharaohs is a complete blank. Geoffrey Martin's Egypt Exploration Society excavations between 1975 and 1995 documented the deliberate destruction of military reliefs in Horemheb's own pre-pharaonic tomb at Saqqara. Scenes showing Amarna period army formations and foreign captives were systematically destroyed, while adjacent non-Amarna military reliefs were left untouched. Egyptologist James Allen of Brown University has documented how the Damnatio Memoriae campaign didn't just erase names, but specifically targeted the iconographic style of a 10-cult military imagery. The Abydos king list, compiled around 1279 BCE, jumps directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, a gap of approximately 35 years, as if four pharaohs simply never existed. The 382 Amarna letters, discovered in 1887, show Akhenaten directing active military campaigns across Canaan and Syria. Yet none of the commanders named in those letters appears on any surviving Egyptian monument. Anna Stevens of Monash University's 2012 isotopic study of Amarna's population found workers with origins spanning Egypt and Nubia, a deliberately assembled population that was then dispersed with no administrative trace. Some historians, including Joanne Fletcher, have suggested Akhenaten's army represented something politically unique. Soldiers who answered to a god-king rather than to a temple system, making their elimination not just theological, but a targeted removal of institutional loyalty that could outlive a heresy. Akhenaten's army was erased by human hands wielding chisels. The next army was erased by the one weapon even empires cannot fully control: the silence built into their own official record. The army of Sennacherib. The Taylor Prism sits in the British Museum today. It is a six-sided clay hexagon, baked hard, inscribed by Assyrian scribes recording every campaign of King Sennacherib in precise, obsessive detail. Every city taken, every king humiliated, every shekel of tribute extracted. And then it reaches Jerusalem. It records that Sennacherib surrounded the city in 701 BCE, that he shut King Hezekiah up like a bird in a cage. And then it moves on. No fall of the city, no conquest, no looting recorded. For a document that itemizes everything, that silence is the loudest thing in the British Museum. Three completely independent ancient sources, the Hebrew Bible in 2 Kings, Herodotus in History's Book 2, and Sennacherib's own royal annals, all confirm a massive Assyrian army besieged Jerusalem. Only the biblical account explains what happened next. 185,000 soldiers dead in a single night. Assyriologist Eckhart Fromm of Yale University identifies the Taylor Prism's construction, tribute paid without city capture recorded, as a deliberate rhetorical deflection unique in Assyrian annalistic language. Herodotus records an Egyptian tradition of field mice gnawing through the army's bowstrings overnight, which classical historian John Bright interprets as encoding a plague outbreak. Geologist Amos Frumkin of the Hebrew University, publishing in 2011, identified a major epidemic event in Levantine sediment cores consistent with 701 BCE dating. Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons in 681 BCE and never launched another Western campaign despite his empire remaining intact. Behavior Israel Finkelstein of Tel Aviv University notes is consistent with a commander who had suffered a catastrophic, politically unacknowledgeable defeat. Three separate ancient traditions all record the same failure. The empire's own stone record simply goes quiet at the moment it matters most. What was Sennacherib so afraid of admitting that he built his silence into the official archive of the most powerful empire on earth? From a silence carved into stone, we cross the Black Sea to a kingdom where one of history's most dangerous armies didn't just disappear. It took its secrets with it, and Rome may have hunted those secrets deliberately. The army of Mithridates VI. For 40 years, one man made Rome bleed. Mithridates. The Sixth of Pontus wasn't simply a king, he was a military laboratory operating on the Black Sea coast of modern Turkey. He spoke reportedly 22 languages. He developed history's first documented antidote, the Mithridatium, a daily poison immunity compound containing 54 ingredients. And his soldiers deployed toxic honey to incapacitate advancing Roman troops, leaving wild rhododendron honey near Roman camps so that soldiers would consume it, collapse in seizures, and be massacred where they lay. When Pompey finally crushed his kingdom in 63 BCE, Rome didn't just defeat an army, Rome erased a military archive that may have taken centuries to assemble. Strabo's Geographica. Book 12 records the Trabzon incident around 67 BCE, in which a Roman detachment under one of Pompey's generals consumed Pontic honey and was slaughtered incapacitated. the first documented use of gryanotoxin as a battlefield weapon, validated by modern toxicological analysis published in Clinical Toxicology in 2002 by Gunduz and colleagues, confirming the region's rhododendrons still produce the same compound today. Pliny, the Elder's Natural History book. 25 records that Mithridates' research scrolls were captured by Pompey and brought to Rome for translation. Adrienne Mayer of Stanford documented in her 2003 work that Mithridates maintained dedicated poison specialists, soldiers trained in the cultivation and battlefield deployment of toxic plants, knowledge transmitted within family units. Plutarch's Life of Pompey records that Pompey dispersed Mithridates' surviving army by individual relocation, soldiers deliberately separated to prevent any unit coherence or institutional memory from surviving. The mainstream view holds that Mithridatic knowledge was absorbed into Roman medicine, but absorbed without its practitioners, its oral traditions, and its experimental continuity is just a list of ingredients without a formula. The deeper military pharmacology died with the specialists who held it, and Pliny himself noted that the antidote formula he received was already corrupted and partially illegible, as though the original had been damaged before he ever saw it. From an army whose knowledge was specifically hunted, we cross the Atlantic entirely, to a king who didn't wait for an enemy to burn his military records. He burned them himself, openly, and explained exactly why. The Aztec military records burned by Itzcoatl. Most historical erasures happen after defeat. An enemy burns your monuments, rewrites your chronicles from the outside, and the victors inherit the narrative. What happened under the Aztec king Itzcoatl around 1427 CE was different. He had won. He was in total power. And he gathered the historical records of his own military, the lineage books of the warrior orders, the battle accounts going back generations, and he burned them himself. His justification is recorded in the Codex Florentino, Book 10, and it is one of the most striking statements in ancient history. The old records were destroyed because it would not be wise for all the people to know the paintings, and those without discretion would be confused and greatly harmed. A king explaining on the record why the record had to die. Miguel Leon Portilla of UNAM documented in his 1963 Aztec Thought and Culture that at least 3 distinct pre-Aztec warrior traditions, Toltec, Chichimec, and Colhua, maintained military orders whose names appear in fragmentary surviving glyphs but whose organizational records are entirely absent from the post-Itzcoatl corpus. His court historian, Tlacaelel, then wrote new official histories presenting the Eagle and Jaguar warrior orders as Triple Alliance inventions, despite their ritual structures showing complexity that could not have been created in a single reign. The Codex Xolotl, one of the few pre-Aztec documents that survived in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, shows military formations and organizational symbols that correspond to nothing in the post-Itzcoatl official canon. Diego Duran recorded in his late 16th century History of the Indies that indigenous informants told him the pre-Itzcoatl warrior orders had maintained oral histories going back to the fall of Tula, histories that became irrecoverable once cross-checked against burned documents. Archaeologist Leonardo Lopez Lujan found warrior regalia at the Templo Mayor in a deposit layer dated to Itzcoatl's reign that is iconographically inconsistent with the official post-reform military tradition. The mainstream reads this as political consolidation, standard for the period. But the Codex Florentino quotation isn't the language of political convenience. It is the language of deliberate intellectual quarantine. What exactly did those warrior order records contain that a king, at the height of his power, judged too dangerous for ordinary people to understand? From a king who burned his own army's history in open daylight, we travel to a sultan who didn't bother burning records first. He burned the army. Then he banned its name, the Janissary Corps. On the night of June 15, 1826, Sultan Mahmud II gave a signal. The barracks of the Janissary Corps were surrounded and set on fire. Anyone who ran out was killed. Anyone who stayed burned. By morning, the Sultan had issued a decree. The Janissaries had never existed. Their name was legally banned from official documents. Their records were seized and destroyed. Their cemeteries were demolished. The Ottoman government called it the Vaka-e-Hayriye, the auspicious incident. What it actually was the single largest deliberate erasure of an active military institution in recorded history, executed in one night against a force that had existed for nearly 500 years. Historian Avigdor Levy's analysis of Ottoman census records estimates between 6,000 and 10,000 Janissaries killed in Constantinople alone on that night, with empire-wide casualties reaching 20,000 in subsequent weeks. Caroline Finkel documents in Osman's Dream that the linguistic ban on the word Yanichiri was unprecedented in Ottoman administrative history. Architectural historian Ekrem Hakkı Iverdi's 1966 survey of Istanbul documented dozens of Janissary cemetery sites with no surviving markers, stone records of unit affiliations and battle honors going back to the 14th century gone. Virginia Axon of McMaster University identifies the government's official account, published within weeks of the massacre, as evidence of a pre-planned propaganda campaign rather than a reactive narrative. Ottoman archivist Mehmet İpşirli has noted that the Janissary Corps registers that survived did so only in distant provincial archives. The central military record was effectively cleaned out. The mainstream frames this as necessary modernization against a politically destabilizing force. But the Janissaries held 500 years of accumulated siege engineering, tactical doctrine, and institutional knowledge that the new Western-style army Mahmud was building had no equivalent for. Destroying that knowledge made his military weaker in the short term. That was a choice, not a side effect. And the Janissaries maintained a Bektashi Sufi lodge network across the empire, an unofficial intelligence web whose records were specifically targeted alongside the military. What those lodge archives contained, we will never know. From an erasure conducted in the open against an army everyone knew, we moved to an army that Sparta's own government made operationally invisible. So invisible that the greatest historian of the ancient world admitted he couldn't find out what had happened to it. The Spartan Krypteia. Sparta had an army everyone knew about. The Spartiate warriors, the red cloaks, the phalanx. That army is among the most written about military forces in history. But Sparta had another one. It operated without weapons anyone would claim, without orders anyone would acknowledge, and without any official record that it had ever existed. Every autumn, the Spartan state formally declared war on its own enslaved Helot population, a legal instrument renewed annually to ensure that killing Helots fell outside the laws governing homicide. Then it sent out the Krypteia, young men moving at night, hunting the strongest and most capable Helots they could find, then vanishing before dawn. And it worked so completely that Thucydides, the most rigorous historian of the ancient world, explicitly wrote that 2,000 Helots disappeared in 424 BCE, and that no one ever found out how each of them perished. Plutarch's Life of Lycurgus, chapter 28, describes the Krypteia in direct terms. Young Spartiates sent into the countryside with daggers and basic provisions, ordered to kill any Helots found on the roads at night, specifically targeting those who appeared outstandingly strong. Simon Hornblower of University College London describes Thucydides' admission in History's Book 4 as his most striking acknowledgement of investigative failure in the entire text. A contemporary historian documenting a state-run disappearance program and being unable to penetrate it. Paul Cartledge documents in the Spartans that the annual declaration of war against the Helots was a precise legal mechanism to ensure no record of individual acts was required. Anton Powell of the University of Wales has argued that the Spartan ban on written legal codes attributed to Lycurgus constituted a deliberate informational security doctrine, institutional invisibility built into the state's foundations. University of Minnesota archaeological surveys of Messenia identified patterns of systematic burning at Helot settlements inconsistent with natural fire or conventional warfare. Concentrated, repeated destruction of specific villages in areas consistent with documented Crypteia operational zones. The mainstream reads the Crypteia primarily as a military rite of passage, but Thucydides wasn't confused about a training ritual. He was documenting the disappearance of 2,000 specifically chosen people and stating flatly that the state had made it impossible to determine what happened to them. Cartledge and Nino Luraghi of Princeton have suggested the Crypteia specifically targeted Helots with social influence, memory keepers, potential organizers, turning it into a systematic intellectual decapitation of a captive population. It worked. We know almost nothing about Messenian culture from the Helot perspective. Their silence wasn't chosen, it was engineered. From an army Sparta was ashamed of, we arrive at the final entry. An army erased not in secret, not by its own government, but announced in a senatorial decree, celebrated as civilization's victory over barbarism, and written into history exclusively by the people who destroyed it. The Carthaginian Sacred Band. When Rome decided to destroy Carthage in 146 BCE, the Senate didn't just want a military victory, they wanted annihilation. The city was to be physically demolished, the ground cursed, the survivors enslaved. And in the final days of street-by-street fighting, the Carthaginian Sacred Band, an elite force of 2,500 soldiers in full bronze armor, was killed in the rubble of Byrsa Hill, left unburied and then erased by the simple fact that the only people who survived to write that history were the ones who had killed them. Carthage maintained records in the Punic language for approximately 700 years. Military registers, temple archives, battle chronicles, tactical manuals. Rome burned for 17 consecutive days. Polybius, who was physically present as an observer, recorded that the Roman commander Scipio Aemilianus wept and quoted Homer at the sight of it. Even Rome's own generals were disturbed by what they were doing. Appian's Libica and Polybius' Book 38 constitute our primary accounts, both written by men who either witnessed or inherited the Roman perspective. Richard Miles documents in Carthage must be destroyed that Diodorus Siculus's account of the Battle of Cramissus in 341 BCE provides virtually our only direct description of the Sacred Band's composition, because every Carthaginian military document that would have contained their full history was ash. Dexter Hoyos of the University of Sydney notes that even Polybius, who admired Hannibal, had no access to Carthaginian primary documents and relied entirely on oral accounts from survivors and defectors. UNESCO-sponsored excavations at the Tophet Sanctuary between 1975 and 1994 under Lawrence Stager of Harvard recovered evidence of deliberate accelerant-assisted burning at a structure identified by Punic inscriptions as a military archive annex, burning distinct in pattern from the general destruction of the surrounding city. A 2016 genetic study by Penhallow in PLOS Genetics identified Phoenician and North African diaspora markers in modern Tunisian and Sicilian populations, the physical traces of survivors who dispersed but left no written military tradition behind. The mainstream frames the destruction as a straightforward outcome of the Third Punic War, But Cato the Elder closed every speech in the Roman Senate for years with the same phrase: Carthage must be destroyed. Not because he feared Carthaginian armies. He feared Carthaginian memory. An intact Carthage would have told a different version of every war Rome had fought for a century. The sacred band's destruction wasn't just the end of an elite unit. It was the termination of a military tradition with Phoenician roots stretching back 300 years. And it was remembered afterward only in Rome's language, through Rome's eyes, serving Rome's story. 10 armies, 10 erasures, some swallowed by desert, some chiseled from their own monuments, some burned by their own kings, some killed in their barracks on a single night. Taken individually, each case has a reasonable mainstream explanation: logistics, politics, religion, the chaos of war. But 10 cases across 10 different centuries on 6 different continents, all producing the same result: a military force that fought, that shaped the world, and left no recoverable record. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. History is not simply what happened. It is what survived the decision about what to record. Most people look at these gaps and see nothing, because they were designed to look like nothing. You watch this far because you notice the shape of what's missing. That is a different kind of intelligence. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which of these 10 erasures you think was the most deliberate. Make the case. The floor is yours. The soldiers on this list didn't lose battles. They lost something harder to recover: the record that they ever existed. Armies can be defeated, but armies erased from history were the ones truly feared. Subscribe. The archive is yours.